And welcome to this afternoon's Hello and welcome to this afternoon's session. I'm Caroline Gilwood. I've met some of you before perhaps, and I'm the head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion here at RVS. And I'm delighted to be introducing another great Pride Month session here at the Virtual Village Hall. So this afternoon I'm joined by, so the session is Prison to Professor, and this afternoon I've got the privilege to be joined by Professor Andrew Hartle. So Andrew began his career in the RAF when he was a military anaesthetist and a squadron leader for 13 years. However, in 1996, he was outed by a Sunday tabloid newspaper and was suspended from duty. Then he was dismissed from service the following year and his military career was over and he was facing prison. Over the next 20 years, Andrew has built a successful senior career in the NHS, including being the president of the Association of Anaesthetists, and he's now the medical advisor to the RAF and a president of the Tri-Service Society. He's the first out gay man to hold these appointments, and he's also a trustee for Fighting with Pride, the LGBTQ+ military charity. So I'm now going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to share a bit more about his journey with us.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here to help celebrate Pride Month with you. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Royal Voluntary Service for the invitation. You've actually heard almost a potted version of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to take a little bit longer and perhaps illustrate it with a bit more detail. So most talks start with conflicts of interest. And here is a list of the various organisations that I'm either currently affiliated with or have previously been linked with. And it's an opportunity almost for me to blow my own trumpet. But the significance really for me, and of these organisations, I've been a council member of 4 of them and president of 3 of them. The significance to me of this list is not just that they're organisations that I'm currently linked with, but in almost every case, with the exception of GLAD and Fighting with Pride, I was the first out gay man to hold any of these appointments. And actually, in many cases, I'm still the only out gay man to have served in those particular positions. And what's particularly remarkable is that that would not have been possible when I was born. I'm 59 years old today. It's my birthday. And most of these things would have been beyond the realm of possibility when I was born. So let's wind the clock back 59 years to 1965. This is a photograph of Winston Churchill's state funeral. It's just 20 years after the end of the Second World War. In fact, it struck me that when I was born, the Second World War was more recent than the only war that I served in. And that's when history and your personal experience tend to overlap. But in 1965, we lived in a very different world. We had a new Labour government following 13 years of a Conservative government. We had the white heat of industrial revolution taking over. But in many ways, it was still a very conservative society. There were still only 2 television channels, mostly totally in black and white and limited to broadcasting only about 40 hours of television a week. And if you were a gay man, it was a very different world. Because although the death penalty had been removed for gay sex just over 100 years before, being gay was still mostly illegal, and that the gay sex carried with it still at that stage the death penalty, the penalty of life imprisonment. But what was far more likely to happen was an offence under the Criminal Law Offences Act, which had introduced the acts of gross indecency. Now, the act of gross indecency was not really subject to great parliamentary scrutiny. It was introduced as an amendment late at night, and it introduced an offence which had no definition. Gross indecency was gross indecency, and it changed the lives for gay men in particular, and it led to what was known as the Blackmailers Charter. Because it was an offence without any victim. But this was punishable with up to 2 years imprisonment with or without heavy labour. And this wasn't just a theoretical risk, this was a very real risk. Convictions during the Second World War had fallen away significantly. It said that there wasn't much you couldn't get away with in the blackout, but also that the country was far too busy fighting a war to pay too much attention to the personal lives of the millions of soldiers, sailors and airmen who were drafted. But after the war, things changed significantly. And the gentleman here on the left with the headphones on is David Maxwell Fyfe. David Maxwell Fyfe was a lawyer and a Conservative politician. He was briefly the Solicitor General at the tail end of Winston Churchill's, a Solicitor General and Attorney General during Winston Churchill's administration at the end of the Second World War. But more significantly, he became Home Secretary and then Lord Chancellor when the Conservatives came back into power in the 1950s. And he was on a mission to rid England of this male vice, this plague, by which he meant homosexuality. And during his time in leadership at the Home Office, then prosecutions and convictions for gross indecency in particular increased significantly. And hundreds and thousands of men each year were going to prison because of convictions under that section of the code. And there was a regular drip of stories in the newspapers. Now, there are a number of very famous convictions. The chap on the left is Alan Turing, famous now as one of the code breakers of Bletchley Park, and a man whose face you can now find on a £50 note. Now, Alan Turing was convicted of gross indecency in Manchester, but his offence was not widely reported, and his significance was not widely reported because his work at Bletchley Park was still classified as an official secret. But Turing went on to kill himself. He, rather than going to prison, he was offered the alternative of chemical castration. And the effects of that were so devastating that he went on to commit suicide. Rather more famously at the time, Lord Montague of Beaulieu was jailed for a year for an act of gross indecency with two national servicemen. The first trial was abandoned because the jury couldn't reach a verdict, but he was convicted on the second attempt at Winchester Assizes and served a year in jail for an act of gross indecency. Interestingly enough, Montague was not completely disgraced because he went on to found the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu and admitted in later life that he was bisexual, but denied to his dying day that he'd been guilty of this offence on this occasion. But the law was somewhat, well, not random, but applied with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on who you are. So this gentleman, rather intimidating photograph, is Bob Boothby, who became Baron Boothby. Baron Boothby, who at Oxford was, according to Wikipedia, he's known as Palladium because he could perform twice nightly. But Bob Boothby was quite definitely bisexual, not that discreet about it. But he had a long-standing affair with Harold Macmillan's wife, but also, particularly in the 60s, had a relationship with his driver. And it's still unclear. His driver was also associated with the Cray twins, and it's still uncertain as to whether Boothby and the Cray twins ever met, or certainly ever met in a sexual sense. But Boothby was named in a newspaper and sued successfully for libel, and was considered probably too important and too almost untouchable. So who got convicted was somewhat, and who was persecuted was somewhat random. But conviction under this act would result in losing jobs, being struck off from medical registers, and a whole range of penalties, and definitely scandal. But thousands of people, several thousands of people a year, were going to prison for this. And so in 1957, John Wolfenden was commissioned to chair a committee on homosexual offences and prostitution. There's an interesting conjunction there. And it was the same Maxwell Fyfe that commissioned Wolfenden. Not quite sure what I've done with the spacing on Wolfenden's name there. But Wolfenden was commissioned by Maxwell Fyfe to chair not a royal commission, but a working party. And they published their report in 1957. Now, Wolfenden was one of the great and the good. He was he'd been a headmaster of Shrewsbury School, and he went on to become, I think, Pro-Vice Chancellor of Reading University. He was a regular on Brains Trusts and government commissions. But he's an interesting choice to chair this report because his son was gay. He was a journalist and probable spy. Said that when he was posted by the Daily Telegraph to Moscow, he could indulge his twin passions for alcohol and men. And he died tragically young in somewhat strange circumstances when he hit his head and died. And it was probably the effects of the alcoholism on his liver function that caused his death. But Wolfenden had a clear conflict of interest, but probably one that in the 1950s he didn't declare. But Wolfenden and his colleagues made a number of recommendations, essentially saying that this was a victimless crime in most cases and should be decriminalised. But the report, which was published in 1957, then sat on the shelf for many years because no one was prepared to take it forwards. And indeed, Maxwell Fyfe, when he then became Lord Kilmuir and entered the House of Lords, said he wasn't going to go down in history as the man that abolished buggery. And so it took some time, and after several false starts in 1967, the Sexual Offences Act 1967 was passed. Now, the Sexual Offences Act 1967 had a number of sponsors in the House of Commons. It was sponsored by Leo Abse, who was a fairly out gay man, and it was given parliamentary time by Roy Jenkins, who was then the Home Secretary. And it's been suggested, in fact, in later biographies of Jenkins since his death, that Jenkins had at least one, if not more, gay relationships whilst at university. But in the House of Lords, the Act was sponsored through the House of Lords by Arthur Gore, who was the 8th Earl of Arran. And Arran's interest was that he became the 8th Earl of Arran because his older brother, the 7th Earl of Arran, killed himself, almost certainly, because he was gay. And although this act was groundbreaking, indeed, it has been described as decriminalising homosexuality. Of course, that's not true. There was partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and the only intention was that people didn't go to prison. As Arthur Gore himself said here, no amount of legislation will prevent homosexuals from being the subject of dislike and derision, or at best of pity. So it wasn't advertising it as a good way of life, and it didn't improve the standing of gay men in society, but it partially decriminalised it. And it's worth just looking a little bit about what was permitted. So the previous Act of Buggery was repealed and it allowed for acts of gay sex between consenting men aged 21 or over in private. And the definition of private was quite specific. And so it was still excluded entirely from the military and the merchant navy, but hotel rooms were not private. Halls of residence and digs were not halls of residence, and it was not private if two people were upstairs in a bedroom in a house and somebody else was present in the house. So private was very private, and clearly public places were not decriminalised in any shape or form. But by 1967, there was partial decriminalisation, and this essentially was the world that I grew up in. So I was 2 when this act came into effect. So for all of my thinking life, there has been at least partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, but with a different age of consent at 21 rather than 16 as it was for heterosexuals. Now, the legal changes need to be seen against the backdrop of societal change. There was a general liberalisation of society's attitudes to gay people, ethnic minorities, women, and these are marked out by the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York, shown on the left, and Gay Pride. The first Gay Pride march in London was in 1972. I think that's actually a photograph from 1974, where the police are almost outnumber the protesters. And the first march was notable not only for the fact that there were homosexuals walking through central London not in disguise, but on view. But immediately after the march, they all went to, or a large number of them went to Hyde Park and had a mass kiss-in, because that was still indecent. That was still an offence, an act of gross indecency. And that was in many ways much more provocative than simply marching through town. And convictions for gross indecency continued to increase during the 1970s, even though there'd been partial decriminalisation with the 1967 Act. At the same time, there was a growing political movement in the same way that there was Women's Lib, there was Gay Lib, and this was a manifesto published by the Gay Liberation Front, and they talked about the different forms of oppression that were experienced by gay people. So there was external oppression, that which you experienced from others. So there was persecution, discrimination, and liberal tolerance. And liberal tolerance is perhaps where we are now, where it's okay but not as good. Some of my best friends are gay type argument. But they recognised that one of the greatest forms of oppression was the self-oppression of internalized homophobia, of hating who you are because society wouldn't accept it. And I can certainly attest to having experienced that. So here's me. This is now 1976. This is my first day at secondary school. I'm just 11, and I show this really just to show that in that photograph I'm gay. I don't think I knew that I was gay in that photograph. I now know that what I was feeling was that I was gay, because being gay, a lot of the conversation is going to be about sex. And certainly a lot of the discussion in newspapers and tabloids, and a lot of the arguments are about sex. But actually, sexuality is much more about how you think, how you feel, and who you love. When you're growing up, you don't know how everybody else thinks, because you only know what's going on inside your mind. And it takes quite a long time to realise that what you're thinking and feeling is different to most people. This was a time before any sex education. I'm actually still waiting to get my sex education talk at school. I sort of managed to miss that, but it wouldn't have been particularly helpful. I think there was some discussion about worms and rabbits, neither of which I found particularly relevant. But recognizing that I felt differently to other boys and about girls and what society accepted slowly dawned in. And I was very conscious that I was beginning to be different to other people. And one of the other problems growing up is that there were no role models. For those of you who are of my generation or older will know that actually the only gay men that you saw, where you either saw people who were in the tabloids or the Sunday newspapers because they'd been convicted of something, so the naughty vicars type convictions, or you saw the extremely effeminate Larry Graysons of this world, and that and this of course is a period when blackface was still acceptable, and women on television wore short skirts and got paid differently. So it's all as a picture of what society accepted. Perhaps the only exception, whether it's necessarily a positive role model, Julian and Sandy on Round the Horn on the radio was much more subversive. I mean, they were very camp, but they were very, very funny. Whereas most of the time you had Larry Grayson or the likes of people in It Ain't Half Hot Mum, or Are You Being Served, and a lot of the stereotypes of effeminate camp gay men, but no positive role models at all. Nothing to, it may not be criminal anymore, but you're not going to have a happy time. And the first time, in 1982, or actually 1981, I think, when it was first broadcast, 1982 was when I saw it, with Brideshead Revisited, was really the first positive portrayal of a same-sex relationship. And it's actually not, it's a same-sex friendship and no more. But this was a really important moment for me, because it showed two friends having, it doesn't, of course, no one in Brideshead Revisited ends up happy. It's a very moralistic story, but there is a period, the halcyon days at Oxford and drinking, with teddy bears and drinking champagne under trees. It would have been lovely to go home to a house like that, and I didn't. It would have been lovely to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but I didn't. I went to the dark, satanic, brutal 1960s architecture of Leeds University, and my experience of Leeds University in 1982 was not that of Sebastian Flight, sadly. But I arrived at medical school at the age of 17, and shortly after I arrived there, I did in fact have my very first, relationship, pash, whatever, with another undergraduate. Now I was 17, he was 19. We were in a hall of residence, so it was all still, if you remember the Sexual Offences Act, it was all still completely illegal. But he and I together in the spring of 1983 saw this programme, Killer in the Village, the Horizon programme, and this was the first mainstream public look at what at that stage still didn't have the name of AIDS, and we would go on to know was caused by HIV. And certainly the effect on me was chilling, because up to now, being gay wasn't going to meet with much support. So it wasn't what my parents wanted. There were no positive role models. It was pretty clear that society still didn't approve of it. But now you were going to die. And it did to me what I think it did to many people. It drove me a long way back into the closet. And it's interesting that, in fact, at my time at medical school, we learned very little about homosexuality, except that there were some rather gruesome bits in forensic pathology. And of course, by the time I graduated, we knew that HIV caused AIDS and that you were going to die if you got it. So here we are, 1987. This is a very young looking, and in fact very young, I'm 22 there. This is me graduating from Leeds University as a newly qualified doctor, still very closeted. I've had the one relationship lasting weeks in my 5 years previously. And then perhaps to confuse or complicate life, I've actually gone off and joined the Air Force. And I had always wanted to join the military. I've been very interested in a military career, and I was fortunate enough, and I still say fortunate enough to join the RAF as a medical cadet. And that may seem a strange choice for someone who's gay, because remember, homosexuality was still illegal in the military. And it didn't seem that strange to me at all, because it wasn't stopping me from doing anything. If you remember, I'm got no role models. I haven't met anybody apart from once. I'm absolutely terrified of being gay and of having sex and the whole thing. So I'm essentially asexual at this stage. And so joining the military didn't stop me from doing anything that I wanted to do. And it really wasn't a problem for quite a long time. And I also want to say a couple of things about the military. I owe the military an enormous debt of thanks. I had a great time for most of my time in the military. I really enjoyed being an RAF officer. The RAF took a very shy, introverted, somewhat precocious teenager, because I was 19 when I joined, and turned them into a much more confident, outgoing, successful, and if you read my annual confidential reports, the Air Force thought I was a successful professional officer. And there is no doubt that a lot of the success I have had in life is in large part to what the Air Force taught me. But at the same time, there were some difficulties. The whole thing about people who are gay joining organisations where it's not allowed is studied in some depth, and Alan Downs' book The Velvet Rage devotes a chapter to it, and it explains in some detail why gay men might join the military, the police, the priesthood, areas where it's not allowed. And there's an element of, well, I'm not doing anything about it, so it's not stopping me from doing anything. And if I'm in one of those organisations, no one will think I'm gay. And it's sort of hiding in plain sight type thing. There's a lot of psychology. It's not good for your psychology. I can assure you, it's not been great for my mental health over the years, but it's perfectly understandable. Society still was not a great place, although being gay is still permitted once you're 21. Then society is clamping down. HIV/AIDS was very much an excuse for society's intrinsic homophobia to exert itself. Some of the liberalisation that had been happening in the 70s was stamped on, and certainly the tabloid newspapers in particular, and some of the right-wing press, used it as an excuse to clamp down further on its criticism of gay society. And in 1988, Section 28 was introduced. Interesting enough that I hate to say it, not hate to say this. There are some things about Margaret Thatcher that I agree with her wholeheartedly. She was right about climate change. She was right about Europe. Personal opinion, but she was definitely wrong on this, because she said that children were being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay, whereas we now come to know they do have an inalienable right to be gay. But we'll come to that shortly. We talked a bit earlier about role models. Some of you will probably remember the outcry when there was a kiss, and it was just a brief peck on the lips in 1989 on EastEnders, and there was a call for EastEnders to be taken off the screens, and the usual suspects got very upset about it, and most of the tabloids got upset about it. Of course, Lord Michael Cashman went on to become an MEP and now a very prominent member of the House of Lords. And this would be considered quite, I don't think anyone gets upset about it these days. My military career is developing. I went off to, I was involved in the first Gulf War. If you can spot me in the back row of the photograph on the right, I had a terrible flat top, and thankfully this photograph doesn't show the detail. I had an even worse moustache. But it wasn't all good. So although the military experience was generally good for me, there was a real downside. I ended up in a very inappropriate relationship with an abusive relationship with a very senior officer, and I had nowhere to go to complain about that. And for most of the last 30 years, I have blamed myself for that relationship. I now see it for what I think it really was, which was grooming and an abusive relationship, and one that would now be classified as military sexual trauma. But I had nowhere to go and no one to complain to. And in fact, when for other reasons that officer's conduct came under scrutiny, I was then interviewed under caution for several hours by service police, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, as an offender, not as a victim. And I discovered that I'm actually a much better liar than I thought I was. But I would defend that absolutely to this day as self-defense and survival. And I think the attitude now in the military would be utterly different. Things just beginning to improve in the civilian life. Edwina Curry here introduced an amendment to the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994. This was an act principally concerned with raves and loud music that characterised by a repetitive beat. But there was an amendment which brought the age of consent for gay men down from 21 to 18. That was passed by the House of Commons. An attempt to bring the age of consent down to 16 was unsuccessful. So there were slow steps of improvement in the lives of gay men. This, of course, is the era of AIDS, and there are. I'm not going to try and tell you what it was like to be a gay man at the time. I have to be honest, I was still so pretty much closeted. It didn't directly impact me, apart from a constant sense of fear and worry. I worked in the mid-1990s on an intensive care unit in central London, which had a lot of HIV patients. I, of course, was still a serving military medical officer. I was on leave from the RAF. I looked after lots of mostly young gay men dying of PCP, and some of them died very quickly. I found that very, very difficult. There were times when all I wanted to do was to reach out and hug people, and I couldn't do that. And I experienced some lovely care and some brilliant care, but I also experienced some horrendously homophobic comments by colleagues, and the way that we treated, in particular, the friends and partners of AIDS patients was at times horrendous, and has changed dramatically. And in fact, AIDS changed dramatically in 1996. You can't really talk about life as a gay man in the 90s without talking about AIDS. And in 1996, effective antiretroviral therapy was brought in. And you can see very suddenly in 1996, people stopped dying of AIDS, and deaths dropped, and AIDS diagnoses dropped. HIV diagnoses increased significantly because more people had tests, because you could now be treated. But life changed significantly. Life also changed for me significantly in December 1996. This is what happened to me in December of that year. Someone I had gone out with briefly over the summer, who was HIV positive, sold a story to a Sunday tabloid that I was a gay HIV positive surgeon who'd operated on the Queen at Buckingham Palace. And that's a good story, and I would have published it, but unfortunately most of it wasn't true. But enough of it was true that I was gay for the RAF to suspend me. And so I was now, for a period of time, facing two enemies. I had a battle on my hands with the News of the World to control the story so that whatever they published didn't destroy me personally and professionally. And I also had a fight on my hands with the RAF, who were clearly going to get rid of me, and it was a way of doing that in the way that caused the least damage. I look back now with some affection, because that's the closest I'm ever going to get to Tom Cruise. So in 1997, finally, I was dismissed from the RAF and joined the NHS. The NHS, I'd just like to say, was not as perfect as it was not a perfect place to work. There was a lot of ingrained conservative, homophobic attitudes and behaviours. I had no choice but to be out. Once 3.5 million people have read about your sex life over their cornflakes, it's quite difficult to go back into the closet. And so I was outer than I would ever have chosen to be. And generally speaking, people were not bad to me, but I can certainly remember in one hospital, shortly after I became a civilian, being ordered out of the operating theatre to see the Director of Occupational Health, to be told that I had to have an HIV test or be suspended from duty. And that was despite the fact that at the time I was and still am HIV negative and in a non-exposure prone specialty. But there was a great degree of suspicion and unpleasantness. Now, in 1999, 4 specimen cases by members of Rank Outsiders, the campaign group, had reached the European Court of Human Rights. And in 1999, the ban on gays in the military was overturned. And then in 2000, they were offered compensation. Very few gays who've been dismissed were offered compensation, because the Ministry of Defence made it quite difficult. I had been out for more than 2 years, and so was not deemed to have standing at an employment tribunal, and a lot of people just didn't bother. But the ban on gays in the military was overturned 24 years ago, and the military of today is transformed, and I'm very excited that on Saturday I'll be marching with the defence contingent at Pride in London. And so also in 2000, I have got on with my career. That's on the left, that's me in San Francisco. I celebrated my birthday with 3,500 close friends in San Francisco City Hall. That's San Francisco Pride. And then I returned, having worked in the States for 1.5 years, to St Mary's Hospital and became a consultant there in 2001. I'm pretty certain I'm not the first gay consultant. I'm certainly the first out gay consultant anaesthetist. Undoubtedly, there have been gay consultants before me, possibly not in anaesthesia, but certainly nobody that was out in my department. The age of consent finally came down in 1997. Ewan Sutherland on the right here. This is Ewan. Ewan used to work at Imperial, and this is Ewan and me at Pride, I think 2 years ago. Ewan Sutherland successfully took the United Kingdom to the European Court of Human Rights to say that the unequal age of consent was discriminatory, and the European Court agreed in 1997. But it took until 2001 for the government to introduce legislation to bring down the age of consent. And it was a hard-fought battle, particularly in the House of Lords, and ultimately the Labour government of 1997 had to impose the Parliament Act for only the second time to get this act through the House of Lords. Things were different for gays in the military because they didn't actually require parliamentary legislation to bring about the change. And over the course of the noughties, then the laws really came tumbling down, and we went from a period of time of proscription to permission. So things stopped being banned to being permitted, and then almost actively encouraged. So civil partnership came in 2004, and my now husband and I became civil partners in 2007. Then recognition came in. IVF was permitted for same-sex couples in 2008, although it's still not funded by the NHS for gay men. And then the Equality Act, the granddaddy or grandmother of equality, was introduced in 2010. And in fact, many of us thought that 2010 and the Equality Act had laid to rest a lot of the ingrained discrimination. But more recently, there's a significant anti-trans movement, particularly in sections of the press that we thought we'd seen the back of. And it's very discouraging to see a lot of the same arguments used against trans people that were used against gay people in particular during the 60s and 70s. A language that's often not helpful, isn't kind, and takes a very extremist view. And actually it's much more helpful if we talk to each other rather than at each other. Significantly for me, the same-sex Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, brought in 2013. This is the least romantic thing I've ever done in my life. That's me and my husband. When we did our free upgrade from civil partnership to marriage, we literally went into an office at Westminster City Hall. The lanyards, by the way, that's not on my work ID badge. That says visitor, because we're visitors in the registrar's office, and it's us two and a registrar and a computer and a printer. And at a certain point, the registrar prints a new certificate, and all of a sudden you've been married since the date of your civil partnership. And why do you do it? Why does it matter? I did it for the adjective and the noun. I wanted to be married and I wanted to have a husband. So, and now we can. And so during the same period of time, as the law changed, then my career is advancing, and you can see here the various organisations that I've been involved with. And I have to confess, I was a bit stroppier than I would had I had my choice and left the Air Force. If I'd had my first choice, I'd still be in the Air Force to this day, and coming up to retirement. Having left if I'd left the Air Force under slightly different circumstances, I would not have been as out as I have had to be. But then, having been outed and subjected to that experience and that ordeal, I was then very, very, very cross. And I'm still very, very, very cross. And years of therapy allow me to say that I'm very, very, very cross. But I was very keen. I was motivated to show them how good I was. And I have to say, revenge isn't quite the right word, but just to show them how wrong they were. I took every opportunity that I could. So I became a very young clinical director, chaired various committees. I stood for election, and surprisingly was elected on my first occasion to council of the Association of Anaesthetists when I was only just 40, and then ended up as honorary secretary and president. I'm not going to claim I was the greatest of any of those things. and certainly my mental health was suffering at the same time. And so if any of my colleagues from that era are watching, my apologies. But I have undoubtedly been successful and effective, if not necessarily happy, until more recently, when I have to say I'm much more content in myself. What changed? Why did things get better? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I think 1997 clearly saw a landmark election. So things weren't perfect. So Labour in opposition had promised rank outsiders that they would lift the ban on gays in the military on their first day in office. And I was still serving my period of suspension in May 1997. And I spent several months thinking I was going to be allowed to stay. And it only dawned on me very close to my actual exit date in July that I was still going to have to leave. And the government made a political decision to be forced to repeal the ban once the European Court made its ruling. But Jack Straw, undoubtedly, as Home Secretary, was motivated to introduce the Human Rights Act. And Jack Straw was particularly motivated to improve the lot of gay men. Jack Straw and I very briefly went to the same school, not at the same time. I went only there for 2 years before we moved. But in Jack Straw's autobiography, he describes one of his schoolmates killing themselves. I think they gassed themselves, killing themselves when they were found doing something gay. It may or may not even have been gay. It may well have been a teenage thing, but a teenage schoolmate who's killed himself because of the shame associated with being gay. And so there was definitely a change in political will to bring about the changes in the Human Rights Act by repatriating that sort of case, and meaning that we didn't have to keep going to Strasbourg, meant that each of those rights was slowly introduced. But the other really important thing that changed is that we stopped dying. You've seen this graph before. In 1996, we stopped dying, and in the 80s and 90s, gay men and lesbians and their trans colleagues working together have become very, very powerful political forces, forcing through a lot of the developments in AIDS diagnosis and treatment, particularly so in the United States, but in this country as well, with organizations like ACT UP, Terence Higgins Trust. And in 1996, when suddenly there's this breakthrough and we stopped dying, those attentions started to change direction, because once we weren't dying, people now wanted to live, and they learned how to be political. And so a lot of that redirection of political force and energy, it becomes very apparent. And it's about the same time in this country that Stonewall is created. And Stonewall was incredibly controversial at the time, certainly within the gay community. You have veteran protesters like Peter Tatchell, who have been campaigning for years in a very aggressive way, and they were very critical of the likes of Ian McKellen and Stonewall, who famously went and had coffee at number 10. And of course, Ian McKellen then went and got a knighthood. And I think what's really telling about that story is that actually in any campaign you need both sorts. You need the angry, shouty campaigner telling everybody how bad things are, and then you need people who build bridges and have conversations. And whether that's party politics or geopolitics, whether that's Ireland or gay rights or whatever, that combination of shouty and talky seems to be what works. So that was a major change in gay rights campaigns. Let's just talk a little bit about the country as it is now, as I'm looking at the time now. So this is the most recent census data from the United Kingdom. About 2% of the UK population aged over 16 classified as LGBT. And I just try and explain that graph on the left. Basically says the younger you are, the more likely you are to be LGBT. So in the 65 and over group, it's only about 0.75% of the population identify as and report it in the census. There's a whole lot of people not reporting it. But when you come down to the 16 to 24-year-olds, 4% of the population identifies LGBT. And I think what we're discovering is that the younger generations are not as threatened, don't feel the need to be categorized. and aren't ashamed to admit it. So gender fluidity, I think, perhaps. It's also remember that this, although the legal situation has improved dramatically in the United Kingdom, that's not the same around the world, and that's largely our fault. It's a legacy of empire. So in so many former colonies, Section 377 of their penal code bans gay sex, essentially, and so very, very slowly are some of those bans being overturned, and around the world, essentially, you can see again lots of detail here. And this is a slightly out of date slide, but essentially, in the Americas and Europe, then this is just about same sex. This is just about same-sex sex being legal, whereas for most of Asia, Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, it's illegal, and in many cases still punishable by death. And in many places, things are getting worse. So, for example, in Putin's Russia, the situation of LGBT people is much worse now than it was 20 years ago, and certainly it's a much more controversial area and a much greater split between red and blue states in the US. Looking at medicine, I'd say that the NHS wasn't perfect. So the Americans removed homosexuality from their diagnostic manual in 1973, whereas the World Health Organization listed it in 1977. In 1980, the British Medical Journal refused an advert for a group of gay doctors who were just trying to meet other gay doctors. The Gay Medical Association was created in 1982. It wasn't until 1990 that homosexuality was delisted from ICD-10, which is the world classification of diseases. And GLAD, the Association of Lesbian and Gay Doctors and Dentists, which I'm a member of the advisory group, was formed in 1994. The NHS is still not perfect, but there are beacons of hope. The Rainbow Badge Scheme was created here. Mike Farquhar is a paediatric sleep specialist at the Evelina Hospital in London. He created the Rainbow Badge Scheme. I'm very proud to have had one of the original 100 because I was part of the gay medical Twitter. Michael got into all sorts of trouble for using the NHS emblem without permission, but he thought it was much better to get forgiveness than permission. And this was actually then adopted by the NHS. And it's important to say that this badge is not identifying the wearer as LGBT. It simply says, I am a safe person to talk to. Because we know that tolerance for LGBT is varying in different bits of society, depending on where you come from, what your ethnicity is, what your race is, what your religion is, and that there are children growing up who do not have allies, have no role models, all that thing I talked about earlier, growing up knowing it's not allowed. And all a badge says is that I'm someone it's safe to talk to. And it was been massively successful. It cost virtually nothing. It was launched in 2019, and there were more than 250,000 badges made. More than 60% of all trusts have adopted it in one form. It's been adopted in Scotland, it's been adopted in Ireland, but government funding for it stopped in February of this year, although the Rainbow Badge Accreditation Scheme continues. By 2022, 20 years after I became a consultant, here at St Mary's in London, about a quarter of my colleagues, 25% of the consultant anaesthetists in my department are LGBT. And I was the first one in 2001. Not for long. I was joined quite quickly by two other colleagues who had not had quite the same notoriety that I had. And we find that across the country there are areas where there are no role models and areas where there are role models, and it becomes self-perpetuating. Trainees that come through my department know that it's a safe place to be gay, and not just be gay, but be successful. We've published elsewhere about the experience of gay doctors and gay trainees. And although I say that I was outed in 1996, actually, even now people are sometimes surprised when I tell them that I'm gay or that I have a husband. And actually, the experience of most LGBT people is that you are continually coming out from the day you come out to the day you die, whenever you meet people. And for young doctors who move regularly, my colleagues move every 3 months, there's a constant dilemma of, do I tell people, do I not? What do I do when I meet a new person? So it is life is better, but it's not perfect. As far as gay in the military is concerned, well, as I've said, life in the military has been transformed, and I'm very, very proud to be associated with defence in 2024. I've met LGBT servicemen from all 3 services, and I say I'm very excited to be marching with them on Saturday at Pride. The charity Fighting with Pride was set up only 3 or 4 years ago and has had a dramatic impact for those veterans left behind, because we now have 20 years of people who've served with distinction and honour and promotion and achievement in the military as out LGBT personnel. And then there are people like me, and I'm one of the younger survivors, who were dismissed 25, 30, 40 years ago. And Fighting with Pride has been fighting for us, and I'm very proud to be a trustee. The government created an independent review chaired by Lord Etherton, and that reported last July, and Rishi Sunak apologised on behalf of the nation for the way that we were treated, and it was described as a stain on this country's military history. We are still waiting for some of the details of the financial and non-financial reparations, and some of my colleagues are still living in poverty, having never got their careers back on track, and I'm enormously grateful that that wasn't the case for me. And then looking more widely, the General Medical Council has apologised this year for historic homophobia, for doctors that were struck off for things that really should have been personal and private. And I was very proud to have worked with GLAD and the GMC, and the GMC listened very carefully to what we said. And GLAD's work was led by Duncan McGregor, and I was very pleased to support that. And these things are important. We think almost all the doctors affected by this are probably dead now, but for their families and how they're remembered, it's an important distinction. I've got one final thank you as I finish up, because I'm conscious of time. So David Maxwell Fyfe, when he was out of government office between 1945 and 1950, he was the chief UK representative at the creation of the European Declaration of Human Rights, which went on to the creation of the European Court of Human Rights. And it was that European Court of Human Rights that has led to the Human Rights Act, the overturning of the ban of gays in the military, and the imposition of an equal age of consent. And so David Maxwell Fyfe, the most outrageous homophobe possible, led indirectly to greater equality for me and my generation and those that follow on. So David Maxwell Fyfe, I suspect you're spinning in your grave, but thank you. There is more about me if you want. I was part of a documentary on Channel 4 last year. If you go to Channel about George Michael, who I never met, but they made a mini documentary about me and my experience with the RAF. If you go to the Channel 4 website or Catch Up TV, there's a small 7-minute video there if you've not had enough of me already. And that's me done, prison to president, a history of my lifetime. I'm very pleased to be where we are today. I'm conscious of the time, but I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Andrew, what an absolutely fascinating journey you've taken us on. I loved how you weaved your own personal experience into those legislative changes and some of those pretty horrific, actually, sort of media invasions of privacy, and also to celebrate some of the changes that we've had in legislation and law to make it a bit more of a comfortable place for us as LGBT folk to live and work. So I've got one question from somebody in our community. And first of all, they recognised that this was a fascinating and actually heartbreaking story. And thank you for sharing it with us all. But their question is, what and where do you see as being the next battleground for LGBTQ plus people?
Well, I think I hinted at it in the talk. I think the battleground is now about trans rights, and as I say, it slightly surprised me because I thought it was a fight we'd already fought and won, because the Equality Act should have avoided the need for this. But I'm conscious that we're in the middle of a general election campaign, and some of this is controversial stuff because it does appear in party manifestos. But I will say that a lot of the turmoil has been driven by media. I'm a great fan of social media, but at times it doesn't help the debate because it does polarize what we think and feel. And frankly, people whose views don't matter or shouldn't matter get the opportunity to say what they want, and we hear them more. But I think trans rights, the way that we, the whole area of gender recognition, how we treat people in hospital, I think sadly what's missing from this is kindness and respect for individuals on all sides of the debate. And I think what we've got is people taking an increasingly extreme view and shouting at each other. And as I said earlier, we have to meet in the middle at some point. It's a really contentious area. I'm always wary of wading into it because it's not an area I understand well. I'm just struck by the need to be kind to each other, and that's the bit that seems to be missing from this debate most of the time.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that, Andrew. And I think something that sometimes concerns me is that we get into this kind of Olympics of equality, don't we, in terms of whose rights come first and who's come last. And I'm always a great believer is that actually we don't need to relinquish somebody's rights in order to give somebody else rights. And I think it's about how do we educate ourselves, in a way that is human, and that actually we all have got human rights and that we treat people with dignity and respect and try and understand, individuals' experiences, I guess, really. So, yeah, thanks so much for that. So we've got another question, actually, which is, what do you think about the UK withdrawal from the ECHRC?
Well, we haven't, and it's interestingly not in any party's manifesto this election, I think. But
maybe we should say what EHR is.
The European Court, the European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg jurisdiction. That was the sort of penultimate slide that set up by Europe in the post-1945 world. The European Court of Human Rights is a product of British law. It was written principally by British lawyers. David Maxwell Fyfe, I said no liberal, no friend of gay men was David Maxwell Fyfe, but he set up a court that applies human rights. As far as I don't understand why we would leave it. The only countries that have left the European Court of Human Rights, I think, are Belarus and Russia. It doesn't. I don't think it. I always like to go through I can't remember all the rights, articles 1 through 12, but it's which human right do you not support on a very simplistic level? Do you think people should be subject to torture? Do you think people should be put to death? Do you think people should not have the right to a fair trial? Do you think people should not have the right to privacy? So I think it's become an easy meme. It's become a substitute for difficult questions, and it's like blame Strasbourg. Strasbourg, interesting enough, wasn't always a bastion of support for LGBT rights. It took Paul Johnson, who's the professor of law in Leeds now, was in York, who's done a lot of the work with Michael Cashman, has written a really fascinating work about this. But actually, it took quite a long time for Strasbourg to swing in favour of LGBT rights, and the first few attempts failed, and so it only reflects society's changing attitudes, and codifies them. So I think it would be a huge mistake for us to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. And in life, in politics, in the law, sometimes you win cases and sometimes you lose cases. And the reaction to losing a case is not say, well, I'm going to change the rules. I think you just accept you accept that that's the way things are, and generally, because without the European Court of Human Rights, we probably wouldn't have women's rights, the right to equal pay, and a lot of the protections that minority groups generally have. So it gets picked on, I think, and look at generally it's been a force for good in this country and across Europe.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. I think that's a really measured response to, which is a really complex question, actually. But one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, which I always bear in mind, is that we have been given these rights, and I celebrate that. And, you know, how the progression and the progress in terms of people's understanding and acceptance of difference and identities, not just LGBT, but lots of different identities, is fantastic. And it's all part of social change, right? And societal change. However, as much as we've got them, they're quite easy to strip back as well, aren't they? And you touched on that slightly in terms of that global slide that you had, in terms of, you know, some countries where things are still illegal, and actually where things were legal, but actually they've now changed. And I think that's something, you know, somebody mentioned the battlefield. I think that will always be a challenge for us, or any minoritized community, that, you know, we have to hold on to those rights that were hard fought, that they can also be stripped back as well. So I think that's always something we have to be very mindful of.
Yeah, I think because and the right to free speech applies to everybody, so it gives people who you don't agree with the right to say things that you don't like, and the answer is not to ban them. The answer is to engage with people and have not to throw rocks at each other from a distance. The really difficult thing is that you have to engage with other sides of the argument. That's the only way we make progress. And you look at, if you look at, extremes perhaps, but South Africa after apartheid only worked because people, you had a military struggle, but people who were prepared to talk and compromise and forgive. And if we look at Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, there was a military struggle, which at times was vicious on both sides, but ultimately people sat down and talked, and they had very hardline opinions, and they fought to the wire, but in the end they came to a compromise, and not everybody got what everybody wanted, but there was compromise, and then they moved forward and they forgave. And I think that's the process. And I think with a lot of these conflicts, it's respecting the other person's right to disagree with you. I think the challenging bit is when people want to impose their views on another person. So anybody can have their view about something, but whether it's reproductive rights or gay rights or whatever, it's you're free to do what you like, but you're not necessarily free to impose that on somebody else. I think that's the bit we just need to remember. And I go back to what I said, it's be kind in all of these things, be kind if you can.
I think that's a fantastic place for us to end today, with that message about kindness and respect. So there's nothing left for me to say, but thank you very much, Andrew. And from myself and all of Virtual Village Hall and all of Royal Voluntary Service, a very happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was your birthday today. So many happy returns. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute privilege to have you share your journey, and your messages, and how you share that is so important. So a heartfelt thank you from all of us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Have a great Pride Month, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, Andrew. Bye-bye, everybody.